So we have today Sue, Steve, and Kaimar congregated to talk to us about what does Wardley mapping mean for them. Given that Wardley mapping is not always the easiest subject to get first time, and seeing as I think every single map camp we've had, it's been like double the numbers of the previous year. So I'm always aware of the number of new people who are trying to make sense of this sense-making framework. And so I think this is a particularly useful talk for anybody who's new. So I'm going to get started. I think we're going to start off with Kaimar today. Hi, Kaimar. Do you want to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your talk?
Sure. Hi. So my name is Kaimar Karu. I'm currently residing in Estonia. Used to live in the UK for a few years, working for a company called Axelos and beyond. And then my latest role back in Estonia was to the Minister of Foreign Trade and IT for the government of Estonia. So that's hence the mapping and minister angle of my session as well. So should I kick off?
Please go ahead. Before you do, I'll just remind everybody something I should have said, which is just, as with all the other talks, please put your questions, your thoughts, your comments into the chat for us to discuss in between the talks, and then of course at the end. Thanks, Kaimar. Go ahead.
Cool, thank you. Okay, sharing the screen as well. So what do Wardley maps mean to now a former government minister? First, perhaps a few words about Estonia, the digital nation. So Estonia, I would say it's not just a digital nation. It's perhaps the digital nation, and we have been doing quite a lot. Most of these things, I would say, out of necessity over time. As we kind of regained independence, the infrastructure we had in place, or actually, well, I can't even say we had an infrastructure in place. We didn't have much in place, so we had to build things that we needed. So what we have had over these years, the digital ID, for instance, together with digital signatures, we have had that since 2002. And this is something that is given to every person who becomes a citizen of Estonia. So if you're born, you get your ID card, and together with that, you get your digital ID. And you can use your digital signatures the same way as you can your physical ones. Connected to that, we have a e-residency program. So e-residency is where we allow others or people from other nations who are not our citizens to kind of use the infrastructure we have created, and it's mainly business focused, and at the moment we have more than 13,000 companies in Estonia that have been established by e-residents from all around the world, including the UK. We have a digital cabinet, so digital government, which we have had since 2000. So most of the things that we do not require us to print out stacks of paper to get stuff done. Most of our public services are also digital, 99% of those. At this stage, you cannot get married nor divorced online, but we're changing that as well. We have had online voting since 2005. So local elections and national elections also take place online, and the number of people who use that option is growing over the years. The online tax system is perhaps something that is maybe most well known, or one of the success stories that has been shared really widely. We have been doing taxes online since 2000, and it's mostly automated. Most people, most organizations can go through this process with only a few clicks. And of course, the secure digital healthcare and digital education solutions. And while I wouldn't say that these are the best there could be, because there can always be better, both the digital healthcare with data sharing between the hospitals and the doctors, and the digital education systems that we have in place have proven to be quite useful during the COVID crisis as well. So that's kind of the background from Estonia. This is the digital nation, and I would say that it goes much further than digital transformation. So it's not just transforming the the business as usual, so to say, but it is creating completely new or novel solutions for our citizens and also our businesses. So part of the job as a minister, of course, is decision making and decision making in difficult situations. So if we go back to the idea of 5 factors with the purpose, landscape, climate, doctrine, and leadership, and try to answer the questions, the why, the where, what is the influence, what are the principles to follow, and the actual how of how to do the work. For the government of any nation, at one hand, it might feel that it's quite easy. So that there's a reason why there's a government, and government needs to be able to lead the country. But it's not just that, or it's too simplistic. So for purpose, it's the international purpose of the country and the government's role in this, the domestic view, the municipal view, the societal view of everything that the government does, the ideological or political view as well. So which way to go, which way not to go, what is the impact of this, what do we believe in any current time, the environmental aspect of things, the technological aspect, short-term goals, long-term goals. So these are all different aspects of the why. So there's not really one answer to why. So it's complex. The same applies, to be fair, to landscape. Again, kind of no nation is out there alone. It's the international aspect, the societal, and so on. So all of these have an impact on decision making. And of course, when we get to climate, the same applies. So you get the drift. Climate, doctrine, leadership. There are many angles to all of these five factors. And perhaps the challenge for the technocratic politicians. So I haven't been in politics for that long. My career is in kind of IT management. The challenge is that what needs to be done is not always what needs to be done today. And it's the political aspect, but because this kind of is true for the next 4 years, or whatever your election cycle is. So the decisions that are made while you're in the office follow the election cycle, and they are not necessarily, or very often they're not based on what you might expect they should be based on. So what needs to be done is not always what needs to be done today in this political role, and that lasts until the next election. So as an example of mapping, or the kind of bringing in the concept of mapping to public sector services. So let's explain that, or let's expect or imagine that a public service or public sector service is indeed on the right-hand side of the map. And of course, kind of this is more or less what we would expect as well. So we would like public sector services to really be ordered, they should be known, they should be stable, standard and obvious, they should be easy to use. It should be not very expensive for the government to provide all these. So kind of perhaps the public sector services should be there, and perhaps they should definitely not be there where we talk about chaotic, uncertain, poorly understood, and so on. But at the same time, if you think about the characteristics of that side, some of these things are perhaps what you would expect from a forward-looking government. So services which are changing, which are different, which are focused on future worth, they might be unusual as well, which kind of gives you the competitive advantage. The government perhaps should be experimenting as well. Should the services be exciting? Yes and no, perhaps. Rarely do people wake up in the morning with a thought, I would really like to interact with the government today. That doesn't usually happen. But at the same time, kind of this novelty approach to public sector services, novelty approach to what could be supported by the government, and perhaps also compared to other countries, is quite interesting. So maybe the public sector services, they should belong here, or they live here, or at least they start here. So let's think about that. And then of course the question is, what's the next step, or where will it be ending? So will it ever get to commodity, or perhaps Genesis to custom built is kind of the pathway for public sector services, or perhaps Genesis to product is the pathway to for these public sector services. So we have this question, and of course the situation for the government is slightly different than it is for the private sector, because of course you always have the question, should we build something or should we buy something? But also from the government's point of view, we can also legislate, in that sense that we can order things to happen, right? And this is something that is not very common for the private sector, except for instance, or perhaps really large corporations like Amazon, or any other corporation that works very closely with politicians. In any case, so let's imagine that we're starting with custom built, or we're currently in the custom built part with the service in mind, and the path there is we are expecting this to really become a commodity as well. So kind of maybe this is the journey that we will kind of have in the next few years, or perhaps what the government should be focusing on is the enablers, or the enabling constraints, to borrow from the Canadian discussions, that whatever the government does on the right hand side, it's really there, sometimes, often, or always, to enable something to happen on the Genesis side in the private sector. So kind of we are helping the private sector to get quicker to novel, changing, different, exciting, rare, experimental approaches. So in my view, the government's job is to create the conditions for the desired outcomes to become possible. So the government's role is not to do everything themselves, actually do as little as needed, but mostly to create the conditions for the desired outcomes to really become possible. Another kind of example, for instance, would be digital identity. I mentioned we have had that for quite a few years in Estonia, but context matters. So when we talk about digital identity, it means different things for different countries or communities. So for some, it might be a completely novel idea that they're just starting to think about, and in their context, it's in Genesis, or perhaps it is something that you can build yourself, or it's something you can take from another country as a service, or the technology, let's say you can reuse the technology, as you can, for instance, with the Estonian system or infrastructure, you can implement that in your country as well. Or perhaps it's commodities like it is for us. And perhaps it's commodity that actually leads to something which is in Genesis, something completely new, something that can be built on top of the digital identity. So context matters. And like one of the enablers for the digital identity to work is trusting your government. And I understand this might sound like a very, very novel concept to many, which means that for those for whom it is a novel concept, anything that has to do with digital identity kind of sits on the left-hand side. So it's something that is almost unthinkable. Not for us, but yes. So the ways we understand context, so what I have been using to understand or better understand the context, of course, CYNEFIN was mentioned before with the 5 domains, and with the kind of going into this or looking at the situation or the context or the system for the lens of CYNEFIN, and keeping in mind that there are no best tools for whatever the situation is. It's like the tools, the approaches, the technology, whatever we use is context dependent, and what works in clear or complicated does not work in complex, or what works in complex is not necessarily the best or even the working option for something that kind of is currently complicated and clear. And of course, with this as well, it's different viewpoints. So when we talk about situation or a system, for some people or some groups, or some society, it might feel clear or complicated. For someone else, it might feel complex, and so on. So different viewpoints matter as well. And as kind of in the government, you have to keep these viewpoints in mind all the time, So you can't just choose one viewpoint and go with that. You have to consider different viewpoints that all have an impact, and also which are impacted by whatever you decide. So the navigation of complex systems, which kind of based on the CYNEFIN materials, it's not possible to engineer the future state. So you have to remember that. The system itself is dispositional rather than causal. So whatever you do, you cannot expect things to work out exactly how you imagined. They will not, they never will. So you have to keep that in mind and kind of design your approach again around that. Coherency appears in retrospect, for instance. Hindsight does not lead to foresight, and always actions will have unintended consequences. And this is something every politician learns on more or less on their first days as well. So these are the things that we have had to keep in mind when you do sense making and mapping in complex systems, and government and politics certainly are complex. So what has been helpful, for instance, things that I have found over time to be helpful, of course, is following various kinds of principles. So for instance, in the context of the public sector and government, the principle that success comes from the collaboration between the public, the private, but also the academia. So it's a triangle. All these three parts need to work closely together for things to be successful. The role of the government is to stimulate public sector, not just build stuff for them, but to stimulate building stuff by the public sector. Centralized platforms to be used by others, but also give the local decision-making power to municipalities. Lots of focus on weak signal detection to understand how things are going. Reusable components, technical and non-technical, to make digital services as invisible as possible. Again, as I mentioned, most people don't really want to interact with the government. So what we have been doing for years is trying to make our services as invisible as possible, for them to just work without you having to interact with them heavily. And of course, putting citizen needs and citizen focus kind of as the key principle for everything. Not new to principles per se. So in my previous role, when I was in London working for Axelos, these were a few of the principles that we figured out in terms of providing value to customers. So what should an organization follow? What kind of principles should they follow to co-create value with their customers? So who wants to learn more about this, there's a link at the bottom there as well. So this is from the axelos.com website. And briefly to kind of go to the enablers that I see as part of making sense, understanding context, mapping where you are, where you're going, is scaffolding, false work, and frameworks. So these are kind of the supporting structure for organizations to use, but these should not be mistaken for the work itself. So these are there to help you to do the work. These are not the work itself. Many organizations, I believe, mix these things up, and too much focus is put on these supporting structures. So there is a Medium post at the bottom. There's a link where you can read more about these ideas. And then kind of the creating better conditions in the country. There's a few pointers here, and I would perhaps kind of bring out one of these especially, which is avoid premature convergence. So when you're working on trying to find solutions for your challenges, try to avoid the situation where you agree too early, which means that you probably haven't really explored the solution space, and you end up with something that is completely substandard for what you need to achieve. And also in terms of influence very often needs to be oblique rather than direct, meaning that the government does not tell people how to behave or how to do things, but creating, as I mentioned before, creating the environment for good things to happen. And overall, the expectations from politicians, from the government, is to be able to engineer the future state, to come up with a plan that in the next 4 years, we will do all these wonderful things and we will be the first nation in the world for absolutely everything. This doesn't really work. So it's more about the managing of or the potential of the present rather than engineering the future state. But the expectations are more on the engineering side. So what I found to be quite useful, again, from the cognitive edge materials from the CYNEFIN framework, is to look at the adjacent possible. So not to look at the bright star at the end of the journey, but look for the adjacent possible and make small improvements and small progress as you go. And that seems to lead to a much better position or much better situation. So that was me.
I've done it. It had to happen at some point today. Didn't unmute myself. Thank you so much. First of all, that's one of the most accessible talks I've ever heard at a map camp, in that it's so clear on objectives. Some of your language, by the way, we need to take some of those slides and put them into the beginning Wardley mapping playbook. So some of the comments you make around really constraining your understanding of what is the work, what is the outcome, I think could really help people a lot. One of the things I liked that you said at the end was this is a framework for the conversation and for your own domain knowledge. It's not that the map is the purpose. I think there's been talks on this earlier. The last talk I chaired was actually around, can you build a business with maps? So I just found so many of the things you said actually transferred directly into that conversation. One question from me, you've started at a secondary point in that you're talking about a government that has decided basically to go with this kind of digital enabler model. Something I'd sort of heard around with people who wanted to do startups, you know, domain registration and such, and I knew Estonia was making it easier for people to do this. Can we move back a little bit, and how is it that the Estonian government nation decided to go down this route? And I can see how mapping has helped in the actual execution. Could you tell us the story around how Estonia decided to go down this particular model or approach?
Well, as I mentioned very briefly in the beginning, we didn't really have a choice. So when we regained independence, we had to build everything ourselves, and at that point it didn't really make sense to build something which feels old. We usually don't like old stuff, so outdated things are not our thing. So we had to build something new, and in many ways there wasn't really anyone to learn from. So when compared to other countries, many of the things that we wanted to happen were something that we had to invent ourselves or figure out how they might work, and figure this out ourselves. And it's the solutions we have found for what works for us are not 100% or even 50% or 10% something that you can just take and implement for any other country. And that's a key thing to keep in mind. So what we have achieved with our approach, you cannot just take this and implement, but there are many principles that we have followed during these years when we're building these systems, these services. Once only principle, for instance, when it comes to asking citizens for data and so on. And these are the things that can be taken over by other countries, and every country then has to kind of create their own supporting structures for these things to work.
Yeah.
And you can't just take it over. So you have to figure out how to make it work for yourself while you follow the same or similar principles. So this is what Estonia has been doing with other countries as well, helping other countries to figure out how to make these things work for themselves. But it's very much about navigating the reality of that country at that time, with the enablers that are required, with the constraints that are in place, both the government constraints and the enabling constraints, and kind of making sense of how things should work, and then assessing where you are right now, which way are you heading, and which of the underlying let's say infrastructure or services or approaches you need to, in that sense, move on the map to a different position for the higher order value things to emerge.
Interesting. So no map is universal. Again, it's the process and the thinking that is valuable. So you mentioned at the beginning as well, trust. This came up in a conversation earlier where we were listening to Toril speak to us about her work with the Norwegian government. And of course, we know through perhaps COVID, right? So the way every government is dealing with the same problem, but dealing with it in very different ways. And the question that raised was around trust levels across different countries. What could you say about Estonia, and perhaps what we can learn more broadly around the world in terms of what were the characteristics of the nation that allowed this to happen in the way that it has? There are other countries, for example, that achieved independence around the same time with vastly different approaches. Well, the real question I want to get an answer to is that how do you measure and quantify trust within a country?
So I would say, first of all, that level of trust in Estonia, level of trust towards the government is very high, very, very high. And one of the reasons I believe why this is the case is transparency. When it comes to public services, when it comes to data use or kind of using personal data, individuals' data, it is already transparent. So the infrastructure that has been created for data sharing is transparent. So you as a citizen, you have an overview, a detailed overview of who has been accessing your details. And if there's something weird happening, so you don't recognize the organization or you don't understand what the purpose was, you can ask a question about who it was and why did they access my data. And if it's unlawful, so of course it is possible to unlawfully access data when you have access to data, but it's all tracked, it's all transparent. And there have been a few cases where people who have done this have actually been persecuted as well. So whenever it has been found out that someone has looked at other people's data without reason or without being allowed to, swift action followed. And when it comes to kind of measuring trust in the country or in the nation or in the community, I think you can measure this by the outcomes. So trust is kind of this weird thing, difficult perhaps to fully define in that sense. But if you look at what is possible in that environment, in that nation, what is possible, what kind of solutions are possible, how people behave, what is the interaction between different agents in that system, you can assess whether this is a trusted relationship or not. So based on the outcomes, I would say.
No, that's great. I can see Steve looks as though he's itching to contribute. Sue and Steve, anything you would add or any questions you'd ask for Kaimar before we go into the questions in the Q&A?
I can jump in, sure. I've got a stack of questions. I'm just going to pick one. So it's the political cycle. You mentioned 4 years, right? So is that impacting our ability to do long-term planning? And is that something that you've mapped out, right? So I'm thinking in particular climate change.
I would, to be fair, I would perhaps say that it's killing our ability to do long-term planning. And I'm not talking about detailed plans for the next 30 years, because that doesn't work anyway. But planning in terms of, again, the kind of creating the enablers. So what needs to be put in place today for this to bloom in 10 years time?
Exactly.
But if in 10 years time, it's kind of somebody else's problem in that sense, from kind of through the political lens. If it's somebody else's problem, it might be yours, but of course, kind of the election cycle with promise, celebrate, then behave as if you're doing something and then apologize or try to avoid the subject before the next election. Kind of this cycle. Even if it's your problem in 10 years time, you can kind of get away from that, or you can solve that without actually solving the problem. But at the same time, in the Western world, there is no better option either. So the kind of the 4-year election cycle or 5-year, depending on the country, the 4-year election cycle, it's a challenge. It's one of these governing constraints that we need to find more ways how to make it work for us rather than against us. So it's not necessarily bad or evil, but I think we haven't yet properly figured out how to make it work for us. And that's the challenge facing us kind of in political terms in the next at least 3 to 4 election cycles, or longer than that if we can't figure out how to make it work for us.
So have you looked at citizen engagement and maybe like the being a digital nation that's leading the world, really? Have you looked at how digital can actually boost citizen engagement, like they're doing in Taiwan, for example? I think the V-Taiwan, if you've come across that, virtual Taiwan.
There's, I would say that perhaps speaking in wider terms, digital in many aspects, it creates additional comfort or ease of doing things or ease of doing business. So when you're smart about how you make things digital, it makes easier for people to do certain things, and when it becomes easier, they're more likely to do those things as well, as long as the answer to the question what's in it for me is answered for them. So we can kind of, in terms of citizen engagement, you can either go to a polling station, for instance, and answer a question, or you can have the same question asked online. So that's kind of a simplistic example. And if there's something at the end of this for you, you are more likely to participate, and then of course you're more likely again to participate if you can do this quickly. But for the citizen engagement to be meaningful, and that's the key, because we can have this kind of fake engagement all we want. We ask all the questions, we get all the answers, and we do absolutely nothing with that, except for like this at one point when we need to get new votes. But the actual engagement of gathering the input, capturing the reality, and then feeding that back into different levels of government. Again, that's the challenge. So how do we figure out how to centralize enough but not too much? And how do we figure out how to give the decision-making power to municipalities, for instance, without things going in various directions, which, again, not always is not always bad, but when let's say the principles are not clear and the objectives are not clear, then going into different directions is a very nice way how to explore possibilities. But unfortunately, every country's budget is limited. Of course, yeah. Today we print more and more money, so perhaps not that limited. But in general, the budget is limited, so we can't explore all the options, and we need to be smart about which way to go.
I kind of want to jump in here. I have like a whole page full of questions. This sounds so dreamy and functional to me. Like the idea of doing my taxes with a couple clicks, it just seems really amazing. But I'm gonna pull a question from the Q&A because it's one that I share from Mark Bergauer, which has to do with the sustainability of the mechanisms that were put in place. I mean, it's not even mechanisms. To me, this seems like you've pulled off a massive culture shift. And usually systems have a tendency to sort of revert back to their sort of old status quo. So I'm just wondering, I mean, maybe that wasn't an option since, as you say, you know, things disappeared in terms of you gained your independence and had to fill in the slots. But I'm wondering if you could say something about that specific question that Mark had. Like, now that you're gone, how sustainable is this?
I think so. In terms of what I managed to do during my time in the office, and the seeds I managed to plant over that time, I think I will see the results of that in the next 5 years or so. And as with any, I would say, top level management or leadership role, the main impact doesn't necessarily come from what you do with your hands, but the way you inspire others. It's partially kind of an inception approach, but sometimes it's much more visible as well. And sustainability is, I would say that in any large system that deals with people, when we talk about change and we try to make change happen, a lot of effort goes into, again, answering the question, what's in it for me? So this is where you kind of, when you try to change things, keeping in mind the different viewpoints and aspects, and when you come up with a proposal of any sort, you don't just come out with that proposal, but you describe that proposal in different ways for different target groups, and also through the lens of what's in it for them. So if groups see value for themselves from something, rather than just something that has been kind of ordered, like you need to do this. If you just say you need to do this, then they might do until you are the one telling them. But the moment you disappear, they will stop doing that. Actually, they will stop doing that much earlier. They just will pretend that they're doing this. But if the clear path to value is there, it's easier to sustain the change. But I'm not saying that this is something that is easy to do. This is extremely, incredibly difficult to do, because you have to keep that up all the time. And in politics, very often there are no good solutions. Like if you make a decision, so in some ways in politics, to not make decisions is the easiest, safest way how to guarantee re-election in 4 years' time. So whenever you make decisions which are slightly more complicated than what you have for breakfast, although that also can sometimes be problematic, but for more complex situations and more difficult decisions, you're bound to piss off someone. So a lot of effort goes, when we talk about democratic states, a lot of effort goes into minimizing the negative impact of decisions made. And that sets lots of boundaries around what you can or cannot do, and at what rate you can really introduce change. So where kind of starting to use new types of digital technology can happen in 2 weeks' time or 4 days' time. So we have had this government hackathons, for instance, where a government institution comes with the challenge, and over the weekend, together with people from the private sector, they come up with a proof of concept to solve that challenge, and then in a few weeks' time, it's live, so citizens can start using this. So this is the rate of introducing new technology. But when we talk about larger changes or more significant movements, this is extremely slow, and it's slow not because we can't use technology or whatever other kind of simple reason there could be. It's difficult because change in the society just is slow, unless you have an event, a catastrophic event at one point, which then makes it very, very fast. But I would say, generally speaking, we try to avoid catastrophic events in our society if we can.
On that bombshell, I think it would be a great point to move to our next talk from Steve Purkis. Kaimar, that was brilliant. I feel as though you need your own side room for a 2-hour question-answer session, because yeah, that was really, really good. Steve, if you could introduce yourself. We will have time for question and answer at the end on all of the talks. So if your question hasn't been answered, hopefully we'll either do so in the chat or during that session. Thanks, Steve.
Yep, hopefully you can all see that now. Yeah.
What do orderly maps mean to me?
Exactly. I am in the right place, aren't I? Okay. Right, so I'll just kick off then. What do orderly maps mean to me, right? So by now, many of you will already know the Fatango story, right? You remember that one? Online photos, Zimke, the world's first platform as a service. Ring any bells? So if you're new to all this, then Simon talks a lot about it in his book on value chain mapping, which you find on Medium. But briefly, to fill in the gaps for people who are new to this, Zimke was this crazy idea of a platform as a service that used JavaScript on the server side. And the idea was that you'd only pay for the compute and the storage that you actually used. This is a bit like utility computing, which is revolutionary, isn't it? Revolutionary. Okay, well, come on. Remember, this was 2006. It was before serverless. It was before Node.js. It was before Docker and all these technologies. It was before even the term DevOps was coined, right? So now all of this stuff is normal. And the reason you've never heard of Zimke before is because it was shut down by its parent company, just as it was about to make a key strategic play. That was open sourcing the platform itself to create standards that would attract others to adopt it. And that would result in an entirely new marketplace, where Zimke would have a small piece of a much bigger pie. What's not to like about that, eh? But hold on a moment, that's a pretty risky idea. Just think about it, it might not work. Who's to say that others would use it? I mean, do they really need it even? And besides, it's not core to the company's online photo business. So why are they messing around with this stuff in the first place? So yeah, when you think about it, pulling the plug on that was a pretty good decision, right? Okay, so this is all old news. Simon's done this story to death. Why am I repeating it? Well, I'm repeating it because it's also my story, right? So here's a much younger me. I used to work with Simon and James. They were the creator of Wardley Maps at Fatango back in 2006. So Wardley Maps have got a personal connection for me. So those maps and that strategy and a brilliant team culture that I'd argue was an early version of Doctrine. So these are the reasons that I joined Fatango in the first place, to head up the dev team. And yeah, you know, it's unfortunate that Zimke, a company with billion-dollar potential, it's unfortunate that it was shut down prematurely, but I still take comfort in the fact that Canon let me walk out the door with Bella the yak. The kids love it. And Wardley Maps has also been pretty useful over the years. So these days, I run a small consulting company. It helps organizations develop their situational awareness to navigate complexity, and there's certainly been plenty of that around lately. So the chaos and complexity that we've seen from recent events, it's changing the landscape that our organizations operate in. I've heard, I don't know how many times, right? So we live in unprecedented times. Or do we? So I've just completed an executive MBA, and you know, think of me what you will. But besides being surprised at how excellent the professors actually were, and the diversity and the talent of all the people in my cohort was brilliant, really. But I was also surprised at how many times this word was mentioned. I'd never come across it before. It was mentioned in every single class. You know, I thought, oh, this is a new buzzword. But the term VUCA, so volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity, it was actually introduced in 1987 by Warren Bennis and Bert Nanis in this book. So if you think back 30 years ago, well, we lived in unprecedented times then as well, didn't we? So it's not to say that the current events don't have an impact. They absolutely do. If you take COVID, then companies like Modal, it's an e-commerce solutions integrator, that on the surface, they looked well equipped to weather the storm. But underneath it all, they're actually suffering without really knowing why. So when you map, you realize that companies like this are suffering from inertia. So Modal resisted this shift to platforms. Well, why? If you think, okay, well, they're a successful business, and using a platform as a service instead of an e-commerce framework that they would install and customize, it meant lower revenues, right? So no hosting, no support, greatly reduced need for bespoke. What are you going to do with all the capability you've built up? And why would you accept less money for a project, right? So these kind of things driving business decision making. These market shifts had early signals in 2015 and they became obvious in 2016. And coincidentally, that was the same year that modals started experiencing issues. So now, like many other companies, they've experienced the COVID forcing function, right? So this is accelerating change. The companies still need to sell, like customers, that is. They still need to sell their stuff online, but they're also looking to reduce spend, right? So they don't want to spend very much. It's loss mitigation behavior, right? Everybody's doing it. And platforms, they offer a better deal. So in many cases, organizations are being forced over this, what Dave Snowden calls a cliff of complacency. The unfortunate ones, they go extinct. And the lucky ones, they take action to stop the bleeding, and they find themselves in a complex situation that they don't fully understand. The sensible ones, hopefully with a bit of CYNEFIN training, the sensible ones cast about with multiple probes. And yeah, those may prompt exaptation, right? So this is reusing existing capabilities for things that they weren't really meant for, like dinosaurs did with feathers, as Liz Kyo has pointed out. Or it may spark a new process of adaptation, right? So selecting for specific function. Exaptation, you know, at least in my experience over the past few months, it can be the quickest route to recovery, and Wardley maps can actually help us to do that. So they can help us to break down our capabilities and look for novel uses, and then you recombine those into new products and services, potentially for new customers entirely. So I guess one of the things that I really like about Wardley maps is that, you know, I'm thinking about them as from a CYNEFIN point of view, as coherent probes that can be used to find new opportunities. And as Winston Churchill famously said in, you know, another time, while working to form the UN, never let a good crisis go to waste. So I'd argue that now we need the situational awareness to help us survive, right? Either that or just dumb luck, maybe both. Well, speaking of opportunities, right? So I'm working at the moment with the exec team at Glasswall. So they're a content security company. They're also sponsoring this conference, turns out. And they've recognized early on that the COVID forcing function would actually cause an increase in demand for their services. So ultimately, that meant spinning up an entirely new open source arm to complement their internal team. So you can see here how we're using maps to explore ideas around their technical strategy. So they're using Kubernetes or K8s, if you're not familiar with the technical terms. So they're using Kubernetes containers to scale up their content disarm and rebuild application. And in doing so, they've hit portability, security issues, and performance barriers in the existing managed Kubernetes services that you find on the market from Amazon, Microsoft, and Google. So it's great when these maps become the basis for a discussion like this. I just love this, right? So this came out of a conversation with Dennis, the CTO, and yeah, loads of scribbles, ruled out some ideas, bounced around some new ideas, and this is how you develop a common understanding, right, that Simon talks about time and again. The act of mapping has actually helped some of the teams understand and communicate their purpose. It's also helped them communicate the life cycle stage that you're at, right? So like the traffic lighting system that you're seeing over there, Discovery, Alpha, Beta, Live. It's helped others express the architecture. So you've got the technical architecture over there, on at least my right, and that translated into a value chain on the left. It's also helped capture important questions on technical decisions that are being made. So again, this is something that Simon talks about time and again. Should we insource? Should we outsource? It's important to consider these things because you might be spending time and money needlessly for something that already exists in the market. One of the other things I love about maps is that they allow us to consider alternative, more effective organizational structures. So I partnered up with James Duncan's company, Stance Consulting, to look at this in Glasswell's context. And what you're looking here at is the current map of Glasswell, but you're also looking at Glasswell's open source new operating model. And we've just started introducing this to improve the effectiveness of the organization. So it's based on Stance's organized services operating model. It's a bit of a mouthful. So it gets abbreviated to OSOM or AWESOM. So rather than using a classical functional hierarchy, AWESOM breaks up organizations into cells that deliver a service, like this. So each cell has got a contract which details the services provided and a service level agreement. It details this to all of the other services that depend on it. And this service agreement in SLA, it doubles as a fitness function to evaluate the performance of the service itself. So the executive does this evaluation, and it also decides which services to spin up, which to spin down, etc. Another key thing about this is it's governing via mandates rather than diktats. This is all based on Wardley maps. In fact, it's actually derived from Simon's universal doctrine. So speaking of doctrine, so those 30-odd principles that are universally useful regardless of your context, well, they're about 10 years old now, give or take. And there's a chance, of course, that more have emerged that we just don't know about yet. So to improve how organizations work, we've got to keep these universal principles up to date. And for my business, this map of Simon's is really important. It's a few years old, but still fairly accurate. And you can see that Simon expects the doctrine to evolve. Earlier this year, he announced a broad study to explore this evolution of doctrine with the intent to update the Wardley maps with the result. So he was looking for volunteers, and I signed up to join, funnily enough, the government working group to look for patterns. So we started looking at why governments exist. And I reckon it boils down to simplifying group decisions, which you can see there on the left, managing shared resources, representing the shared values and beliefs of society. Oh yeah, and surviving and propagating itself, which you can't underestimate. So then we looked at the impact of some forcing functions like COVID. There's a lot of detail here, too much to absorb in a short talk, but again, the important thing to remember is that we're looking for new universally good or best practices as candidates for an updated universal doctrine. So we noticed a trend around being remote. Hey, big surprise, right? But there, so maybe distributed cognition and distributed resources are a new doctrine, potentially. We also noticed changes around tolerance to risk. So this came up when looking at how COVID patient journeys have shifted. And it's worth pointing out that Wardley maps aren't the only form of maps that are useful, right? So this is a journey map. And again, you see this theme around new perspectives on risk. It's come up in a few places. As you can see here, we've come up with a lot of stuff. So if you're interested in digging into this, I think it's running simultaneously now, but I'd recommend looking at Dr. Jackie Taylor's talk in one of the other groups. I'm sure there'll be a good recording on it. So I also teach a lot of people how to map as part of my business. And this learning curve, of course, can be an issue. So anything that we can do to improve how we teach or increase the general level of awareness and understanding of maps will make my life easier. And likely my clients as well. So over the summer, I got involved in another effort led by Mark at Ducati. That's a non-profit that's looking to create training and certification standards around a number of different things, Wardley maps being one. So even if we just get to the awareness and the foundation level sorted, then we're going to be a long way towards spreading a consistently good adoption and understanding of maps. Finally, Wardley and CYNEFIN is another one of my areas that I'm starting to explore a little bit more. I think like many others, right? So Simon and Dave have already noted apex predator theory and inertia. They've got a lot in common. So that's something I'm planning on digging into a little bit more with the two of them, and hoping to come up with some useful material. I've already mentioned maps as coherent probes. And yes, I find this fractal nature of both CYNEFIN and Wardley maps is fascinating, right? So I'm thinking about taking some ideas like from ritual descent, for example. It's another one of Cognitive Edge's practices. You bring that into mapping workshops, improve the map. Finally, I'm looking at using SenseMaker to gauge the pioneer and settler and town planner, the affiliation, so the attitudinal affiliation, and ideally evaluate doctrine as well with micro narratives instead of surveys, right? So if you think about it, it's easier to get, well, it's easy to get tired of filling out the same survey over and over again. And when you tell your own story, you become a lot more engaged, right? So some ideas around that. Anyway, so that's what maps mean to me.
Wow, fantastic. You mentioned, Steve, many times you used the phrase basically taking from that. I haven't willfully planned to steal so much from a slide deck before now. There's some really, really good visual representations of some quite sort of complex ideas in there. Really appreciate that. I wonder, so we have one question in the chat. I wonder, Steve, if you'd mind if we went straight into Sue and then did a shared, basically use the last 15 minutes for the shared Q&A, just to make sure that we get, you know, we give Sue her full time.
Yeah, absolutely. Go for it. Brilliant.
Hi, Sue. Want to introduce yourself and let us know what you're going to be talking to us about today.
Hi there. I am going to introduce myself as part of my talk here. So let me screen share. Okay. All right, hopefully you all can see that. So I am a bit of an outlier here, neither in the private sector, government, or academia. I sort of live in the in-between ether. I call myself a research artist because I had to make something up that fit with my background, which is part engineer, part artist, part academic, part researcher. And so I'll be sort of skipping a stone on the surface of how I make meaning around Wardley maps, which is what this little image is supposed to show. I'm going to just take a little dip into a couple of the theories and bodies of research that, for me, just add a real richness to Wardley mapping. That is as an alternative to, let's see, taking a stroll through how I actually make meaning of Wardley maps, which is this sort of hot mess that you see. Part of this, one of these was made at a Wardley mapping session with Ben Mosier. He does a Wardley 101 thing, and an insight that emerged from one of Ben's sessions was a story can be a useful interface. And I would say that is the case for me because, in fact, it was Simon Wardley telling his really compelling stories that brought strategy even into my brain space. I'm not a chess player. I don't really enjoy competitive gameplay. Not a military historian. So strategy really was irrelevant to me. until I heard his talk. And then I thought, you'd be an idiot not to be strategic about the things that you care about, the things that you think are worth working towards. And the things that I happened to be working on at the time, and still am, I'm part of the Baltimore Quaker Peace and Justice Committee, and I'm also on the board of a nonprofit that seeks to end the use of forced solitary confinement in correctional institutions. And so in these two contexts, the question of should we be strategic, should we be getting strategic, bubbled up, and I thought, okay, here is a great opportunity to like dig in and see if I can use Wardley maps, see if I can make some sense of this. And so here we are a couple years later, and I'm still trying to make sense of Wardley maps, but I took this, my Miro doesn't seem to be advancing. There it goes. This expression showed up on my whiteboard one morning when I was sort of just percolating on, you know, where I'd come to my thinking around Wardley mapping. And it was strategy as integrative reflective practice, which is a whole lot of blah, 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 abstract words. So I'm going to try and unpack a little bit why integrate and why reflect and why I see strategy as so important and useful for that. Quick aside, another way I make sense of this and shared with these groups was the way that I make sense of Wardley's sort of strategy cycle and Wardley mapping. I'm not going to play this video, but this is a video that I made to share with these groups called Getting Strategic on Peace and Justice. And I just wanted to let you know it's out there, it's on Vimeo, and you can find it. It's only 5 minutes long. So Simon's tool has really become, I mean, I make sense with animating, but I make sense more generally by externalizing. I'm, you know, a creative. And so Wardley mapping joined a larger tool set for externalizing that I sort of had in my toolkit. And the thing, you know, others mentioned that Wardley mapping is great for externalizing and sort of diffusing the focus, putting it on the artifact instead of the people who are having the ideas. That's great. I think they make any mapping, whether it qualifies as a map in Wardley's language or not, they make the tacit explicit. They make the invisible visible. They also expand working memory. I did a stint as a research assistant at a lab on attention and working memory, a neuroscience lab at Johns Hopkins. And one of our little rules of thumb was that working memory can hold 7 items plus or minus 2. A lot of us have heard this, but the thing is, if you can chunk a couple things into one thing, you get more things that you can remember. So chunking is a really useful tool for helping us work through more complex problem spaces. And externalization really helps with that. But it also can feel really risky. And this one tool right here, the immunity to change mapping, and Bob Keegan and Lisa Leahy's immunity to change process and theory kind of sheds a little bit of light for me on why it feels risky to put your ideas down on paper in a public space. Their socialized mind is sort of the first epoch of adult development. And I think of it as sort of your inner finger wagger, and it becomes internalized, but we still sort of project it out into the world. And somebody scaffolded this for us at some point, helping us to judge our own actions and monitor ourselves. And those internal shoulds, they're sort of the origins of reflection, but they're also the enemy of reflection. And they can feel really threatening and risky. But there are also risks to not reflecting. And thank you for buying me a little more time, because Steve, you already showed the cliff at Cynefin, the edge of sort of when the things are super duper stable. That's almost the riskiest point because they get rigid, and there is this zone of complacency where you could just sort of fall off the edge of the cliff and things just fall apart for you. And so when I think about this in terms of Wardley maps, I think like, what is not making it onto my map or our map? Because we just don't think about it. It's just the water we're swimming in. So this is sort of the there be dragons in the basement that haven't, what didn't make it onto the map? I don't know what those little monsters are, but it's kind of Halloween-y. I'm going to blast past this next slide too, because it's sort of my, this is how I make sense of things. This is my thinking, my rough thinking about mapping Wardley maps and CYNEFIN to each other. And I think other people have done much better work on this than I, so I'm going to blast past it and come to another why that reflection in general feels so risky. So this insight came while I was in a neurobiology of behavior class. And they showed the case of HM. He was a patient who's been studied his whole life because he had surgery to remove a couple parts of his brain that were the source of his seizure disorder. They did not know at the time that this was actually going to prevent him from forming new memories, because the same parts they removed were critical for the formation of new memories. Now, I'd heard this a million times. I'd heard this story when I came in, before I came into the class, but there was a new bit that was added, which was that HM could still learn new motor skills. And I was like, excuse me? Like, he can't learn new things. He can't even remember that his doctor is his doctor. Every time he meets him, it's like the first time he's meeting him. But he can learn to do new tasks better. He got better over time at doing all these little cognitive or motor skill tasks that they had him do. And even though he learned to do them, he didn't know he knew how to do them. So for me, my big sort of like wonder around this was, you know, the doctors basically created an unclosable knowing doing gap for HM. But does this mean that we all have these sort of, these are not perfectly overlapping learning systems? The learning system that learns declarative things and the learning system that learns procedural things don't fully overlap, or he would have lost both of these. So my takeaway was, it takes effort to put these two systems into dialogue with each other. And I don't think it ever ends. I mean, the other thing that's, for me, I'm going to say a working hypothesis is that these disconnects between knowing and doing play out at every level of social organization and learning. And that includes the micro moves of an individual through our teams and our organizations and our communities, that there are these gaps that, you know, we codify the values, the sort of mission, vision, values of the org, but then we're like, wait, are we really doing that? I don't know. Maybe we've lost our way. So I've put genetic evolution here at the top because I find that this is a really interesting question, because probably one of the things that drew me to Wardley is that this horizontal axis is evolution. And I'm very curious about the dynamics of evolutionary processes. And as an adult, not that long ago, I took Biology 101. And there you learn that the way evolution by natural selection happens is transmission, variation, and selection. That's all it takes. Transmission is inheritance of genes or spreading of behavior. If you take it to the cultural evolution realm that Michael Muthukrishna and Joseph Henrich share in their research, variation is sort of mutation or genetic drift, or in the context of cultural evolution, it's sort of the novel practices or exaptation. Thanks again, Steve, for defining exaptation for me. But the dynamics of selection are where things get really wishy-washy for me. It's just the things that continue to exist. And you hear a lot of people say that what drives selection is competition. I'm not so sure about that. I think of, and partly that's because of digging in with Michael Muthukrishna on his research on cultural evolution and how competition, so selection is just whatever continues. And it might be survival of the fittest, it might be survival of the fit enough. But how, Michael claims that when resources are plentiful, it is actually more adaptive to cooperate rather than compete in a zero-sum game. But when resources are not plentiful, when they're scarce, it behooves us to perhaps even be harming the other people in the game. So the tricky thing about this is that our perceptions affect how scarcity plays out. And we saw this with toilet paper and COVID, right? That it's not just oh, are the resources plentiful or are they not? And a lot of it is perception. So one resource that is sort of at the core of, I think that all of us can argue is at the core of a precious and scarce resource is attention. So this is research from Kathleen Vose, the camp that does what's called ego depletion resource. It's basically how self-control is a limited resource. And they look into all the things like decision-making, impulse control, attention regulation, thought suppression, all these things that take a chunk out of this resource on any given day. And when it's done, it's done. That's where you find yourself flipping the bird, sorry, at somebody driving by, or you just melt down. You can't even decide what to eat for dinner. Like you got nothing left. You can't make any more decisions. But so she shared some fascinating research, like even shifting from deliberation mode to execution mode or back, like, oh, I know we were executing on this plan, but maybe we missed something. That can really trigger people because it's taking a chunk out of this stuff that is really precious. So this suggests to me that this is one of the things that we should be the most strategic about. How are we using this very precious and limited resource? So this brings me back to, I think my slides are out of order, apologies. This brings me back to strategy as integrative reflective practice. So this is why I think reflection is so hard. And one of the things I love about Wardley mapping is that Simon has created a Trojan horse for turning reflection into a game. It's like, okay, it doesn't need to be risky. It doesn't need to be scary. We're just going to play around with it here. And so I'm not exactly sure which way to go to advance. Sorry for the whiplash, y'all. Everyone has had that experience where you're learning a new game at a holiday and everybody's like, we're reading the rules. I don't understand the rules. And somebody's like, you know what? Let's just play the game. We'll figure it out by playing the game. So that to me is what I encounter most often when I'm trying to introduce Wardley mapping to a group is, how do you play a new game when you don't know what the rules are? And prepare yourself for some more whiplash here. So for me, this reflective game is that, so the way that Simon has framed the strategy cycle, it invites these questions, these reflective questions, like, well, what's the game we're trying to win? Like, what does winning even look like when we're trying to end solitary confinement? What about the people who aren't in this room? What's their game? What about doctrine? We're an interfaith nonprofit. What if our doctrine has our underlying unarticulated doctrine has framed correctional officers as the enemy, the people that we're trying to win against? How does one win at that game? That doesn't even make sense. They're the ones, if we make it illegal, they're just going to find another way to do it. Like, it doesn't make any sense at all. So these questions really reveal in a safe way how our approach that we're taking doesn't make any sense. So I'm gonna whiplash you some more here. There are also gifts on in the basement, the things that haven't made it into the map. I often see moves as on other people's maps as moving things to the right of a map. I've been playing around with moving things up, like just pushing stuff out there to the user. Like maybe it has value that I don't know about because it's in my fishbowl. It's in my most stable, automated tool set. So I don't even realize the value it might have to other people. So I'm gonna leave you with one last bit of research, which is research from Dave Perkins and Shari Tishman on skill transfer. They did this with this research where they were trying to make sense of why people who had been through a college physics course and understood force and mass and acceleration, when they were out in the real world, they were still using these really naive concepts for what the effects of an accident between a big truck and a Mini Cooper would be. They were forgetting what they had learned in the classroom. And so they wanted to know, was it that they didn't have the skill, they really couldn't do the problems? Was it they weren't motivated to do the work of doing the problem out in the wild? Or did they just not notice that that skill would be useful in this context? And they found that teachers often assumed it was skill level was missing, but in reality, it was that people weren't noticing these opportunities to translate the skill into a new context. And so that's the thing that I am thinking about this game and pushing value out is, pick up a pen. That's what I don't have to convince people to widely map. I can just pick up a pen in the middle of a meeting. I ask people, can I share my screen? And it has turned these bottlenecks and fear sort of, like, we don't want to play your new game, into like, whoa, how did we live without you doing this live, real time for us? Like, it becomes an essential value of mapping in real time with a group. So that's the end of my talk. I'm going to stop sharing. And sorry, that was a little bit like drinking from a water hose, y'all. I had many more things I would have shared if it wasn't too much.
Oh, that's really great, Sue. After that, what I feel like is I need a 5-hour personal therapy session where you take me through some of these things and tell me where I've made the mistakes across my life that brought in so much that is usually we think of as outside the domain of the map, but actually is all part of the system. So to me, that was brilliant. I made a comment in the chat about how listening to you just brought out this comment. I got a book today, Arsene Wenger, famous football manager, and he was he was seen as a free thinker, shall we say. And I remember him talking once about training elite footballers and how you can use the time when somebody is injured by just playing them videos of themselves doing the thing they normally practice, and how they don't lose the motor skill, or basically it doesn't diminish as much. Because there's a key part of, so I think it exposed to me that what I think is part of the awareness learning system is not always part of the same system. Sometimes it's an overlap and you consider it part of the same system, but actually it's not. Other thing I wanted to talk about was just your diagrams. So I work in sales. The feature, or shall I say the cognitive skill set that I think is most valuable in the job is actually interruption management. Knowing that most of the time I start the day with an empty calendar and I'll have a full calendar by the end of the day. And also whatever I have in, I'll usually expect to have calls left and right. So after 15, 20 years of doing this, I realized that drawing, something you clearly enjoy, we had a chat about being a visual thinker before we got the talk going. And one thing that I realized was I lost my sort of ability to do things like paint for an hour. My brain just doesn't concentrate for an hour on one thing anymore. When I was a kid, this was my favorite thing to do. So often makes me, it really just brought to mind as, again, how the context of how you think sort of reinforces everything that you do, to the point that, you actually change your capabilities. I'm getting well away from your talk, but this is your fault in that you just brought in so much that I want to think about and talk about. But look, we're running out of time. We have questions in the chat, comments in the chat. Let's ask Steve and Kaimar, first of all, for any comments, anything they'd like to add before opening the floor to anybody who has questions.
can jump in if you want.
Please.
Yeah. So yeah. So I really liked your point on selection is not equal to competition. Yeah. So and it's yeah. So the collaboration, competition. I think somebody else was pointing this out in the chat as well. So Randy. And yeah. So I was reading a book by Robert Sapolsky. I'm not sure if you know the name, but yeah, Behave is the book. It's a brilliant book. And it goes into things like kin selection and all that, all like a whole bunch of different types of selection. Have you looked into like drawing anything around that, or is that like considering different types of selection almost?
Yeah,
right?
I mean, I'm currently working on an animation with Michael Muthukrishna on his work around that sort of zero-sum game versus positive-sum game. Basically, I'd look for a collaborator. I'm not very well motivated as a sort of solitude. I mean, I am, but I need to have a collaborator in the mix. And so if I can find any partner to work with, I just jump on it. So Michael and I have been working for months on an animation, and maybe Sapolsky will be somebody I'll reach out to next. Although that whole kin selection is also in the cultural evolution research as well. He corrects me every time I use the word biological versus cultural evolution. He's like, yeah, no. Biological evolution is genetic evolution and cultural evolution. Culture changes biology. And so I'm sort of training myself to use those terms.
Cool.
I'm looking through some screenshots to remind me of everything that I saw during that. Again, I think like with Steve's talk, you can expect I may steal some concepts. I think it will be pretty hard to steal your actual slides and designs without being obvious. But yeah, actually to the question just around the process you go through. So one thing I was thinking actually when I was looking at your diagrams was, wow, you've got an idea, you've put that idea there, and then you're spending a lot of time looking at it while you're drawing. And what do you think in the broader context of mapping? You know, this is about the conversation, not about the map at the end. And I'm just curious from a personal level whether you see, is that something that happens, and do you get a particular extra value of the process of drawing something around what you're mapping? Or is it just simply the job?
No, I think so. In fact, I think it's one of the things that I have that is my resistance to widely mapping is lines and words. And I thought, okay, wait, it's not just, I used lines and words. It's not just lines and words, it's lists and straight lines. And I have a real hard time with those. And so I find it has to really matter for me to whip out a Wardley map, because otherwise I'm just going to have one of those hot mess sense-making sessions. They help. But I got to tell you, what also helps is, I don't know if you guys can see this, I have a German wheel in my living room. That is a circus apparatus that rolls like a giant hamster wheel. So I get on the wheel and I roll around, and it's like, you know, that whole thing about shower insights, like how do you not focus? How do you have an open, if you think about focus as a beam of light, which is how the neuroscience researcher thinks about this, or the mental model. If attention is like a beam of light, it can be super focused or it can be completely open, like one of those little mini mag lights. That open focus is where insight happens. Well-researched finding. That's where insight happens. This is hard to cultivate. If anybody's tried to sustain open attention, if you have any meditators out there, it takes a lifetime of practice.
We've got a couple of questions from Sam Pitton-Smith. Sam actually had a trailer of a question from the previous talk, and I did say we'd try and come back to some of these. So Sam, and consider this is for anyone to jump in. Given your experience in government, what advice would you give to me as someone who has just started as the transformation lead for a large local council in terms of where to start and how to engage others in these conversations? So this was pointed at Kaimar, but feel free to step in, Steve and Sue, as well.
One of the first things I would do is start getting to know people. And they're actually maybe not worldly maps, but impact maps can really have can really play a helping hand there, right? So if you've not come across those before, essentially a mind map with what you're trying to achieve, and then a whole bunch of people who can either help or hinder you. And if you go in there thinking about that, then yeah, so you go out and you'll meet all these people who you think might be able to help or hinder, and then yeah, get into conversations with them, understand them, understand their perspectives, etc. So
I would perhaps add that in these situations, it usually makes sense to go beyond your role to understand the kind of wider or bigger movements in the organization, because the impacts on what you want to achieve comes from various directions, and unless you have a better understanding of the context in that sense, it's very difficult to achieve things, because very often it feels that things are not moving, and you don't understand why. It's just not going anywhere. Something or someone is stopping them, and this is kind of what they would call a dark constraint. And to discover some of that, it's perhaps I mentioned the principles quite a few times, to analyze the wider context for your role and work, and to figure out what kind of principles are being followed in reality, and which ones are there on paper but not really followed, and where do you see the lack of coherence, and does it gives you insight to what is dysfunctional and how it impacts what you want to achieve. So essentially, to get a better sense of the context that you're operating in, and it won't help you to create detailed plans for everything you want to achieve, but it gives you this kind of ability to detect weak signals as they happen around you rather than in front of you, and then tweak your approach accordingly.
Excellent. I see you've answered this one, Sue, but there was a question a little bit earlier, again by Sam. Can you say a little bit more about culture changing biology? You've recommended a book. I just wondered if you could spend a minute just on that.
Sure. So the cultural evolution research basically looks at how behavior gets selected, even if people don't know why they're doing the behavior. And so examples, there are a ton of examples in the book, but things like not eating certain kinds of fish in a country that has fish as a staple when you're pregnant, because it could cause birth defects. If you ask people in these cultures, why do you do this thing? Why do you not eat the eel when you're pregnant? And they'll say something like, it'll give the baby smelly joints. And so that's perhaps a more illustrative of how behavior emerges, even if we don't know why. Really good adaptive behavior. But another example is just the tendency towards eating hot foods. You know, it's not shared among all cultures. It's shared in cultures where it's warmer, where things are more likely to spoil. And so I don't know if those are great examples of changing biology, but they do show sort of how the selection process works on behavior. And in an adaptive biological way. It is adaptive to eat hot foods because it actually kills pathogens in warmer climates. Whereas if you're in Sweden, it doesn't really give you an adaptive advantage, and it kind of hurts to eat hot food. And so unless you're in a culture where it's the norm, you won't do it. I don't know if those are fun examples, but I don't know that they really make the great case about changing biology, but I would highly recommend that book. It's a real interesting read.
Yeah, Sapiens, I forget his name, Noel Hariri. that touches on, I think it's a nice sort of, if you're completely new to the idea of evolution of cognitive science, that talks about, sort of the various stages of human development and then what happened to us in the way that we think. So some of that comes into language, and this I wouldn't take as fact because it's sort of word of mouth through lots of relatives, but my own ethnic group. So I'm from the Luo group of East African, so I'm Kenyan originally, and we're known within our country actually for verbosity. We tend to end up in areas which involve speaking as a job. Your last US president was a scion of our particular group, and it's always been said amongst people who live around us, and we're actually outsiders to our main country in Kenya, but it's always been said amongst people who live around us that this was something that sort of marked us out. I think we have lots of phrases and things that say, Luos are particularly good at doing this particular kind of communication. It wasn't a huge surprise to me when I discovered that there are actually biological differences that can be seen across Luos from other groups. When I look into it, I don't know what comes first, the chicken or the egg, but we do have an unbelievably complex language. Is that us on time? I haven't heard a warning before, but that's it. Look into that if you like. That's a longer term. There are studies on this, on Luos and speaking and language, where you can actually detect differences that don't exist in other groups.
It's been very fun, y'all.
It really has. It really has. Thanks everyone who's asked a question, who's attended, who's joined in. Please do go to the networking area for the chance to meet other people in the audience if you haven't done that already today. And thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks all. Have a good day.